Imagine discovering that human history is not a chaotic chain of events, but a line pointing toward a specific destination. What if the most disturbing signals of our time were described thousands of years ago? Wars that feel sick, crises repeating with uncomfortable precision. Systems that rise promising order and deliver control. Coincidence or pattern? The question is not whether something is changing that is visible. The question is, are we recognizing the map while walking through it? Ancient civilizations recorded warnings about periods of moral rupture, global instability, and concentrated power, not as isolated myths, but as sequences, timelines. And when those descriptions echo the present with such clarity, ignoring them stops being skepticism and becomes historical negligence. Why does this matter now? Because for the first time in history, the entire world shares the same rhythm of crisis. Instant information, interconnected global tensions, economies shaking in chain reactions. What once took centuries now unfolds in years, sometimes months. Ancient prophecies did not speak only of destruction, but of acceleration, of an era where local decisions would carry planetary consequences. Observe the current landscape: recurring political instability, disputes over resources, polarized populations. It takes no mysticism to see the convergence. The question is whether these movements are merely historical cycles, or the alignment of pieces foreseen long ago. When ancient patterns and modern events begin to rhyme, the boundary between past and present becomes dangerously thin. Ancient texts describe periods called birth pains not as a single catastrophe, but as a growing sequence of events: conflict, scarcity, collective deception. The language is symbolic, but the logic is clear. Instability intensifies before a historical transition. This is not about predicting dates, but recognizing stages. Civilizations recorded the idea that collapse rarely arrives suddenly. It announces itself through repeating signals, crises that appear isolated, until a pattern emerges. When we examine accounts of societies that ignored warnings, a recurring theme appears: the normalization of the extraordinary. What once shocked becomes routine. And it is in that silent adaptation that major transformations take root. One of the most persistent elements in these records is the concept of centralization. Power, information, and influence converging into increasingly smaller structures. Historically, moments like these preceded radical turning points. Empires that expanded too quickly, systems promising absolute stability. The inevitable question arises: are we witnessing a modern version of this cycle? Technology capable of monitoring, predicting, and directing human behavior on an unprecedented scale, not as conspiracy, but as the logical outcome of innovation. Ancient warnings spoke of an era where control and convenience would walk together. And when security becomes the highest priority, how much are we willing to surrender? History shows that decisions made in the name of order often redefine freedom. Another striking pattern is accelerated cultural transformation, values shifting within a single generation. Reference points dissolving. Ancient records describe periods where moral confusion preceded social rupture, not as religious judgment, but as historical observation. Unstable societies tend to fracture their own foundations. Today, global debates unfold in real time, amplifying tensions and creating a sense of permanent crisis. This constant pressure reshapes collective behavior. The question is not who is right, but what happens to a civilization that loses consensus about its own rules. Ancient sources suggest that this fragmentation is not the end, it is the prelude, a stage that comes before deep reorganization. When we connect these elements, instability, centralization, cultural transformation, an unsettling image forms. This is not an isolated event. It is a progression. Past civilizations left records of similar periods, always marked by a shared sensation. Something is about to change. The curious part is that these moments were rarely recognized while they were happening. Most only saw the pattern. After the turning point, today, we have the advantage of historical hindsight. We can compare cycles, observe parallels, and ask, are we repeating known trajectories, or entering an entirely new phase? A timeline does not demand blind belief, it demands attention. Patterns do not guarantee destiny, but ignoring them guarantees surprise. There is a point where ancient records converge. The concept of gradual revelation, not a hidden secret, but something visible that few interpret correctly. Signals scattered across economic crises, technological advances, and social shifts that seem ordinary in isolation. Together, they form a narrative. The idea that the end is not necessarily immediate destruction, but structural transformation, a redefinition of systems, values, and power. The most dangerous moment is not collapse, but the complacency that precedes it. When humanity believes it has total control over its destiny, history tends to respond with unpredictability. Then the unavoidable question emerges: are we moving toward an ending or a reset? Historical records suggest that great transitions are preceded by clear signals but rarely recognized as such. Technology gives us the illusion of total mastery, while global events remind us that complex systems are fragile. The tension between progress and vulnerability defines our era, and perhaps this is the core of ancient warnings. Not fear of the future, but the necessity of awareness. Recognizing patterns is not fatalism. It is understanding that collective choices shape historical consequences. If there is a recurring message in these records, it is intellectual vigilance. Not paranoia, but perception. The ability to see connections between past and present. Civilizations that thrived were those that read their own signals in time. Those that failed ignored evidence because it felt uncomfortable. Today, we live in a moment where information is abundant, but interpretation is scarce. A timeline does not require absolute certainty, it requires constant questioning. What feels normal now may be the prelude to something larger, and history rarely sends silent warnings. Perhaps the true meaning of this timeline is not to predict an end, but to reveal a process, a sequence of choices, reactions, and repeating patterns that continue until something changes decisively. The future does not arrive as a surprise to those who observe the signs. It announces itself in cycles. The final question is not when, but whether we are willing to recognize the moment we are living in. Every generation believes it stands at the center of history. Few realize they may be standing at the edge of a turning point. If ancient records are correct, the decisive period is not distant. It is unfolding now, and the transmission is clear. Observe the patterns, while there is still time to understand them.